Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward, glad to share this quiet hour with you. Tell me, is the world outside your window still tonight? These are the hours Watson trusted most, when a careful mind finds what the hurrying day conceals. Do subscribe, so none of these evenings escape you, and you'll find our Spotify channel in the description below. Now, settle in. For as Holmes believed, there is nothing more deceptive than an obvious fact. Chapter 1. The Snowbound Court at Blackthorn Hall. It is a peculiarity of my long association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes that the most singular of our adventures have begun not with the dramatic flourish one might expect, but in the most prosaic of circumstances. So it was on the 14th of January in a winter that I shall long remember for its ferocity, when a telegram arrived at Baker Street shortly after breakfast, and Holmes, having read it twice with an expression of quiet attention, passed it across the table to me without a word. The message was terse, as telegrams must be, but the urgency beneath its clipped phrases was unmistakable. It read, "Critical legal document vanished from locked room. All exits sealed by storm. 6 persons present, all above suspicion. Situation demands your immediate attendance. Roads may be passable by midday. Come at once if you're able. Reginald Forsyth, barrister." "Well, Watson," said Holmes, reaching for his pipe, "what do you make of it?" I set the telegram down beside my toast, which had by now grown quite cold. "A locked-room disappearance," I said, "in a snowstorm, with 6 potential suspects all swearing innocence." "You have the bones of it precisely," Holmes replied, rising from his chair with that sudden, energetic decisiveness which always preceded action. "The flesh, however, promises to be considerably more interesting. A legal document of sufficient importance to warrant summoning us through a January blizzard, a barrister which suggests proceedings of some formality, and a situation in which the very severity of nature has inadvertently provided us with a closed theatre. There can be no better stage for a crime, Watson, nor a more challenging one for its resolution." Within the hour we had secured a private conveyance, and by 11:30 we were making our laborious way out of London and into the white countryside beyond. The snow had fallen heavily through the night and showed no inclination to relent. The fields on either side of our road had been rendered featureless, their hedgerows reduced to vague undulations beneath the drifts, and the bare black trees stood like sentinels along the frozen lanes. Holmes sat opposite me in the cab, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his grey eyes fixed upon some middle distance that had nothing to do with the passing landscape. I have known him long enough not to disturb him in these moments. He was working in his silent and thorough fashion upon whatever incomplete picture the telegram had given him, turning it and examining it as a lapidary examines a rough stone. I occupied myself instead with the view, such as it was, and with my own more modest speculations about what awaited us. Blackthorn Hall proved to be a substantial manor house of the Jacobean period, its dark stone facade softened somewhat by age and by the present generous coating of snow upon its parapets and mullioned windows. It sat at the end of a long drive lined with elms, and as our conveyance drew up to the front entrance, I observed that it had the self-contained, slightly withdrawn air of a house that had seen rather more eventful times. It was the sort of building, I thought, that concealed its histories behind an expression of studied impassivity. A manservant met us at the door and conducted us without delay to a long drawing-room where a fire burned with vigorous purpose, and 5 persons stood or sat in various attitudes of suppressed anxiety. The 6th came forward immediately to greet us. Reginald Forsyth was a man of perhaps 55 years, compact and grey-haired, with the polished manner and careful diction of a successful barrister. His composure was evident, but I have spent enough years in Holmes's company to recognise the small, involuntary signs of strain, the slight tightening about the eyes, the deliberate steadiness of a voice that might otherwise betray its owner. "Mr. Holmes," he said, extending his hand, "I am profoundly grateful that you were able to come. The situation is, I confess, as perplexing as it is inconvenient." "Inconvenience is relative, Mr. Forsyth," said Holmes pleasantly, casting a swift, comprehensive glance about the room. Perplexity, on the other hand, is a quality I find positively invigorating. And pray, introduce me to your company. The introductions that followed occupied several minutes, and I endeavoured to retain each figure with the care that Holmes had always impressed upon me. There was Mr. Arthur Cavendish Mere, the elder of the two heirs to the estate in question, a tall man of 40 with a studied placidity that I immediately suspected of concealing sharper emotions beneath. Beside him stood his half-sister, Miss Dorothea Brent, a woman of perhaps 35, whose manner combined genuine refinement with a watchfulness that was more difficult to read. The widowed matron, Mrs. Henrietta Vane, a relation of the deceased whose estate formed the subject of the deposition, sat nearest the fire, composed in her black dress and regarding us with the calm of long self-discipline. Mr. Cyril Hatch, the junior clerk who had attended the barrister in his professional capacity, was a young man of perhaps 24, slight and fair-haired, whose attempts at equanimity were rather less successful than those of his elders. And finally there was Gideon Price, the estate steward, a weathered and competent-looking man of middle age, who stood somewhat apart from the others, with the quiet but definite air of a person accustomed to knowing every corner of the house in which he served. Holmes listened to each name and regarded each face with the same mild, pleasant attention, and I knew that behind that courteous exterior he was already reading, measuring and filing. "The ledger," Holmes said when the introductions were complete. "Tell me precisely how the matter stands." Forsyth drew a measured breath. "The deposition was taken yesterday evening in the study on the first floor. The matter before us is a substantial inheritance dispute of some years' standing, the details of which I am bound by professional obligation not to reveal in full. Suffice it to say that the testimony recorded in that ledger is of material consequence to one of the parties present. The deposition concluded at approximately 9 o'clock. I locked the study myself and retained the key upon my person. This morning, when I unlocked the room to retrieve the ledger before the others were abroad, the document was gone." "Gone," Holmes repeated softly. "From a locked room," Forsyth confirmed, with the slightly incredulous emphasis of a man who has repeated an impossible fact until it has begun to seem almost ordinary. "The windows are frozen shut from the inside. The snow outside them is undisturbed. No one could have entered or departed, and yet the ledger is not there." Holmes turned to look out of the drawing-room window at the white and silent landscape beyond, where the snow continued to fall with quiet, relentless purpose. "Capital," he said, and I detected in the single word a note of genuine satisfaction that told me Holmes had recognised, in this seemingly impossible situation, precisely the quality of problem that his extraordinary mind required. "Watson," he added, glancing back at me with the trace of a smile, "I believe we shall be staying the night." Chapter 2. A House Sealed by Circumstance. Mrs. Hudson was not present to ensure our comfort at Blackthorn Hall, but the estate's domestic arrangements proved adequate to the occasion. A pair of bedrooms on the upper corridor were placed at our disposal, and a cold luncheon was laid in the dining-room shortly after our arrival. Holmes ate nothing, which did not surprise me, and disappeared almost immediately upon the conclusion of the introductions, leaving me to endure, with as much grace as I could muster, the polite but strained conversation of 5 people who were each, in their several ways, intensely preoccupied with matters they had no present intention of disclosing. I've always believed that there is more to be learned from a gathering of anxious people at table than from almost any formal interview. The small negotiation of the salt cellar, the studied attention given to a bread roll, the careful spacing of remarks. These things speak in a language that precedes and often contradicts the spoken word. Mrs. Vane, the widowed matron, had the composed and faintly sorrowful bearing of a woman who has long since made her accommodations with disappointment and considers it beneath her dignity to show fresh agitation. Arthur Cavendish Mere applied himself to his plate with a concentration that seemed designed to forestall conversation, though once or twice I caught him glancing toward the door through which Holmes had vanished. Miss Dorothea Brent spoke pleasantly, and at measured intervals, fulfilling her social obligations with the fluency of long practice. Only the junior clerk, Hatch, seemed genuinely unsettled, cutting his food into portions he did not eat, and twice beginning sentences which he did not complete. Gideon Price, the steward, did not join us at table. I was informed by the manservant that it was not his custom to do so, which struck me as perhaps more significant than the comment was intended to convey. Holmes reappeared at 1:30, seating himself beside me with the unannounced ease of a man returning from a brief errand. He accepted a glass of water, declined everything else, and conversed with apparent inconsequence about the history of the house, which he had gleaned, so far as I could determine, from the portraits in the entrance hall and the architectural alterations visible along the east wing corridor. Forsyth answered his questions with the cautious compliance of a man uncertain whether he's being studied, which, of course, he was. After luncheon, Holmes drew me aside into the narrow passage adjacent to the dining room and spoke in a low, unhurried voice. "The hall is more constrained than it appears from without," he said. "There are, in practical terms, 4 means of access or egress. The main entrance, which the manservant confirms, was bolted from inside by 10 o'clock last evening. The servants' entrance at the rear, similarly secured, a side door giving onto the kitchen garden, which has not been opened since the snow began on Wednesday afternoon, as the drift against it is unbroken and reaches to the handle, and the study window itself, which, as Forsyth has correctly observed, is frozen shut and surrounded by undisturbed snow. The house, Watson, is as sealed as any I have encountered. Whoever is responsible for the ledger's disappearance did not leave with it. They are in this building now." "That narrows the field considerably," I said. "It removes one class of possibility entirely," Holmes agreed, though with a slight qualification in his tone that suggested he was not yet prepared to narrow the field further. "What it does not remove is the far more interesting question of where, within these walls, the ledger presently resides, and by what means it was conveyed there." I asked whether he had yet formed any preliminary view. "Several," he said pleasantly, "all of which I am treating with the suspicion that preliminary views deserve. Come, let us look at the room itself." Forsyth accompanied us upstairs and produced the key to the study with an air of relieved cooperation, as though the mere act of handing something over to Sherlock Holmes constituted a partial resolution of his difficulties. The study was a well-proportioned room on the first floor, its single window overlooking the white expanse of the rear garden. It contained a large writing table, 3 chairs, a long bookcase occupying most of the north wall, a fireplace, and a standing cabinet of dark wood beside the door. The air retained a faint trace of candle smoke. Holmes moved through the room in a manner I can only describe as methodical wandering. There was no apparent system to his progress, and yet I knew from long experience that nothing fell outside the compass of his attention. He examined the window latch with a lens, crouched to inspect the floor before the fireplace, ran a finger along the mantelpiece, and then stood for a long moment before the bookcase with his hands clasped behind him, his head slightly tilted. "The deposition," he said without turning. "How long did it take?" "Nearly 2 hours," Forsyth replied from the doorway. "We began at 7 o'clock and concluded, as I said, shortly before 9. "And the fire was lit throughout?" "It was. The room was quite warm." "Who else was present during the taking of the deposition?" Forsyth paused with the fractional hesitation of a careful man choosing his words. "All parties to the proceedings were entitled to be present. Mr. Cavendish Mere attended in person. Miss Brent did not. Mrs. Vane was present for a portion of the time, perhaps the first 40 minutes, and then withdrew, saying she found the fire oppressive. Hatch was present throughout in his professional capacity, assisting me. Price was not present, having no standing in the matter, though he attended to the fire once during the proceedings and withdrew immediately. Holmes turned from the bookcase. "At what point during the proceedings did Price attend to the fire?" Another pause. "Rather longer." "I could not say precisely. Somewhere in the middle portion of the evening, I believe." "You believe?" Holmes repeated in the neutral, attentive tone that I knew served him better than any display of pointed interest. "Thank you, Forsyth. I wonder if you would be so good as to ask Mr. Price to step up here at his convenience." When the barrister had withdrawn, Holmes turned to me with an expression I had come to associate with the earliest, most tentative stages of a theory. Not satisfaction, which came later, but a kind of alert watchfulness. "He is an intelligent man," he said quietly, "and he does not wish to implicate the steward. Whether that reticence springs from loyalty, uncertainty, or the preservation of a more convenient narrative remains for the moment an open question. But observe, Watson." He gestured toward the writing table, upon whose surface a circular indentation in the leather was plainly visible. The ledger rested there, a substantial volume, by the depth of the impression, and observe the chair. He indicated the chair nearest the table, which stood at a slight angle, perhaps 2 inches off its natural position relative to the table's leg. Someone sat here who did not restore the chair to its original orientation when they rose. A small thing. But consistent with haste, I ventured. Holmes smiled in the brief, approving manner of a teacher whose pupil has for once arrived at the right answer by the right road. Or with the more interesting possibility, he said, that the person who moved the chair was not the same person who had last occupied it. "Now then, Watson, let us have a word with the steward, and let us see whether his account of his movements last evening is as impeccable as his manner of presenting them." Outside the window the snow continued, implacable and indifferent, ensuring that whatever secrets Blackthorn Hall contained within its walls, they would not be escaping into the wider world for some considerable time. Chapter 3. The Vanishing Without Exit. Gideon Price arrived at the study door with the unhurried, self-possessed tread of a man who has spent a working lifetime moving through other people's houses and has long since ceased to find anything remarkable in the fact. He was perhaps 50 years of age, broad across the shoulders, rear with a face weathered to the colour and texture of old oaken hands that spoke of practical labour rather than the sedentary duties one might associate with a steward of a house in legal limbo. He regarded Holmes with calm grey eyes that gave nothing away, and accepted the invitation to enter the study with a slight inclination of the head that was not quite a bow. "Mr. Price," said Holmes, settling himself on the edge of the writing table with an informality that I suspected was deliberate, "I am told you attended to the fire in this room during the course of last evening's proceedings." "I did, sir." The voice was quiet and even. "At approximately what hour?" A brief pause that might in another man have signified calculation. "7:30, as near as I can reckon it. Perhaps 7:45. Holmes nodded pleasantly. "And the fire required attention because it had been laid in the afternoon, sir, and the room had not been used since autumn. The chimney draws a little sluggishly until the flue has warmed through. I came to ensure it was burning cleanly." "Very conscientious," Holmes said. "Did anyone speak to you while you were here?" "Mr. Forsyth asked me to be quick about it, which I was." The faintest suggestion of professional dignity accompanied this remark. "And in being quick about it, did you have occasion to move either of the chairs?" Price's gaze shifted momentarily, not to the chair in question, I noticed, but to the fireplace, as though reviewing the sequence of his own movements. "I may have shifted the small one to reach the coal scuttle. It stands in the way of the fender." "The small one," Holmes repeated. "You refer to the chair nearest the door, rather than the one beside the writing table." "That is correct, sir. Thank you, Price. One further question. When you entered, was the ledger on the table?" "It was, sir. A large book, dark red covers. Mr. Forsyth had his hand upon it when I came in." "His hand upon it," Holmes murmured, "not writing in it." "Resting his hand upon it." Price considered this with the air of a witness determined to be accurate. "Resting, yes, as one might rest one's hand upon a book that is closed." Holmes released him with a word of thanks, and the steward withdrew with the same composed quietness with which he had arrived. Holmes remained on the edge of the table for a moment, looking at the door through which Price had gone, and then rose and moved to the fireplace. "Well," I said, "or he appears straightforward enough." "Appearances in this room," Holmes replied, crouching to examine the grate, "are precisely what we are engaged in not trusting." He moved the chair by the door. The chair by the table was moved by someone else, at some other time. That distinction matters. He straightened, brushing his hands together. "But there is something more immediately pressing, Watson. Come and look at this." I joined him at the fireplace. The grate contained the grey remnants of last evening's fire, collapsed into ash and spent coals. Holmes directed my attention not to the grate itself, but to the hearthstone immediately before it. A broad slab of dark slate on which, in the far left corner nearest the wall, a faint semicircular mark was just visible in the accumulated dust. The impression, unmistakably, of something cylindrical having rested there or been briefly set down. "A candlestick," I suggested. "Of the right diameter for the pair on the mantelpiece," Holmes confirmed, glancing upward to where two plain brass candlesticks stood at either end. "One of them was placed here, on the hearthstone, at some point before the dust was last disturbed, and the dust tells us something further." He indicated with a careful finger that did not touch the surface a faint smearing in the dust a few inches from the semicircular mark. Something was rested here and drawn along the stone. Not a candlestick. Broader, flatter. About the dimensions, I should estimate, of a substantial ledger bound in stiff boards. I looked at him. "The ledger was brought to the fireplace?" "At some point during the evening, something of the ledger's dimensions rested on this hearthstone. Whether the ledger was brought here to be burned, to be examined in the firelight, or for some entirely different purpose, I cannot yet say with confidence." He rose, his eyes moving between the hearthstone and the dark window with its sealed latch. "What I can say with increasing confidence is this. The ledger did not leave this room through the window. The door was locked before it could leave that way, and the fire, as we can see, was not used to destroy it. The ledger is therefore in this house, and it was moved within this room before it was moved out of it." The impossibility of the thing had begun to arrange itself, under Holmes's patient attention, into something that resembled a sequence of deliberate actions. This, I had long since learned, solci was always the moment at which a locked-room mystery began to yield, not in a sudden revelation, but in the quiet accumulation of logical necessity, each fact reducing the space in which the impossible could comfortably reside. I drew Holmes's attention to something that had been troubling me since Forsyth's account of the previous evening. "He said the windows were frozen shut from the inside," I said. "But the storm only became severe overnight. At 9 o'clock, when the deposition concluded, was it already cold enough to freeze the latch?" Holmes turned toward me with an expression of bright, undisguised approval that he rarely permitted himself. "Watson, that is a genuinely useful observation. Come." He crossed to the window and applied his lens to the latch mechanism with close attention. After a moment he stepped back and invited me to look for myself. The latch was a simple iron bar resting in a slotted bracket. Around the bracket and around the joint between the window frame and the sill was a thin but continuous line of white. "Candle wax," I said, straightening. "Applied to the joint and the bracket with some care. Not frozen at all, Watson. Sealed. To a cursory inspection it presents identically to a window frozen by sustained cold. But frost forms unevenly, following the capillaries of the wood grain. Wax, applied by hand, fills the joint in a steady, continuous line." He allowed a pause. "Someone wished this window to appear impassable, which means that for some part of the evening it was not." The implication settled over me with the particular chill that has nothing to do with temperature. The snow outside the window was undisturbed, yes. But if the window had been briefly opened and closed again before the last significant snowfall of the night, if the ledger had been passed to a confederate outside, or if the wax had been applied purely to misdirect, the landscape of the crime had shifted considerably. "Is there a confederate outside?" I asked. Holmes was already at the door. "That," he said, pulling on his coat with decisive energy, "is what I intend to determine before the light fails. The snow has been our jailer today, Watson, but it is also, if we read it correctly, the most faithful record of last night's proceedings that we have. Get your coat, we're going outside. The afternoon had turned the colour of pewter, and the snow showed no sign of relenting as we descended the main staircase and made our way toward the rear of the house. Behind us, in the drawing room, the assembled company waited with their several anxieties and their impeccable manners, unaware that the seemingly impenetrable mystery of the sealed room had already, in Holmes's hands, begun its first and irrevocable unravelling. Chapter 4. The Geometry of Impossibility. The rear garden of Blackthorn Hall was a study in obliteration. Whatever formal arrangement of paths and beds it had possessed in more hospitable seasons had been entirely consumed by the snow, which lay in great unbroken plains and hollows, sculpted by the wind into shallow ridges that caught the failing afternoon light along their crests. A stone balustrade separated the formal garden from the kitchen garden beyond, and further still a line of yew hedges, dark and ragged, marked the property's boundary with the open fields. Holmes moved along the back of the house with his head down and his coat drawn close, his eyes conducting a systematic examination of the snow beneath the study window. I followed at a slight distance, careful to place my feet where he had placed his, having learned many years ago that careless feet in the vicinity of Holmes's evidence can undo in a moment what patient observation has built over hours. The snow here was perhaps 14 inches in depth, wind-packed to a firm crust that bore our weight without significant compression. It was, in the most literal sense, a perfect record. "There," said Holmes quietly. Stopping some 3 feet from the wall, I came to stand beside him. The snow beneath the study window was, as Forsyth had described it, and as I could now confirm with my own eyes, wholly undisturbed. No boot print, no drag mark, no depression of any kind interrupted the smooth surface between the windowsill and a distance of perhaps 8 feet outward, beyond which the wind had introduced its own irregular textures. The window, some 12 feet above us, showed no disturbance to the snow on its outer sill either. It was, by every visual standard, the window of a room that had remained sealed throughout the night. "Precisely as reported," I said. "Precisely as arranged," Holmes replied. He stood for another moment, then turned his attention not upward toward the study window, but along the wall to his right, and as toward the corner of the building where the east wing joined the main body of the hall. He walked without haste to this corner and crouched in the snow, which was notably deeper here where it had been driven by the prevailing wind. I watched him part the surface crust with careful fingers, working with the deliberate economy of a man who knows exactly what he is looking for. After perhaps a minute he sat back on his heels with a short, satisfied exhalation. "Come and look carefully," he said, without disturbing anything to the left of my hand. I crouched beside him. Beneath the undisturbed crust, at a depth of perhaps 4 inches, the snow showed a different character, compressed and compacted in a manner inconsistent with natural settling. The compression formed a rough trail, no more than 18 inches wide, that ran from the corner of the building in an arc toward the yew hedge at the far end of the garden. It was invisible from any distance and would have been entirely imperceptible had the surface crust not been removed. "Footprints," I said, though the word seemed inadequate for the subtle record before us, made before the heavier snowfall of the night, subsequently buried. The storm deposited its greatest volume between midnight and 4 in the morning, according to Forsyth, who could not sleep. These prints were made before that accumulation, and yet after the snow had begun, otherwise they would not be depressed below the surrounding level at all. He replaced the surface snow with the care of a man restoring a document to its folder. Someone walked from this corner of the building to the yew hedge, and back, in the dark, in a storm, taking considerable pains not to approach the study window itself. "A confederate after all," I said. Holmes rose and brushed the snow from his knees with an air of deliberate withholding. I said I intended to determine that, and I have determined it. Whether the determination supports the hypothesis of a confederate or complicates it considerably is a matter I prefer to leave open until we have returned to the warmth of the house and examined the remaining evidence. There are 2 more items I wish you to see before the light goes entirely. We re-entered the hall through the servants' entrance at the rear, and Holmes paused in the narrow stone passage to stamp the snow from his boots, before leading me not back toward the drawing room, but along the ground floor corridor to a door which, when opened, revealed a modest room fitted out as a household office, containing a writing desk, a row of key hooks, and a high shelf on which an assortment of domestic ledgers and account books were ranged in practical if uninspiring order. Holmes surveyed the shelf with brief attention, and then looked at the key hooks. "The household keeps its own accounting here," I observed. "Yes," said Holmes, "and I note that the steward's office shares a chimney stack with the study directly above it." He looked upward, and I followed his gaze to the ceiling, where the plaster around the chimney breast showed the faint tea-coloured staining of a flue that served 2 rooms on adjacent floors. "A detail of construction with no immediate significance," he added, in the tone that meant it had considerable significance, and he was not yet prepared to explain it. "But come, there is something in the drawing-room I have been waiting all afternoon to examine." The company was assembled when we returned, gathered by the fire with the slightly forced sociability of people who have been keeping each other's company under duress for rather too long. Holmes ignored all of them with the expertise of a man who has elevated selective inattention to a social art, and crossed the room directly to the mantelpiece, upon which stood a pair of candlesticks matching those in the study. He lifted each one in turn, examining the base and the wax pooled around the socket with his lens, and then replaced them with the careful precision with which he had lifted them. Only young Hatch appeared to notice. He watched Holmes's examination of the candlesticks with an attention that he then, becoming aware of my observation, redirected with slightly too much deliberateness toward the window. "Miss Brent," said Holmes, turning from the mantelpiece with a pleasantness that indicated the general conversation was about to become considerably less general. "You mentioned that you did not attend the deposition proceedings last evening. Were you in this room throughout the evening?" Miss Brent set down her book with the composed readiness of a woman who had been expecting the question. "For the greater part of it. I retired at 9:30. "And before retiring, did you have occasion to take a candle from this mantelpiece?" A pause of precisely the right length to be entirely natural. "I took one of the hall candles, from the table in the entrance passage." "Not from here?" "No." She met his gaze steadily. "Is there a reason you ask?" "Simple curiosity about the household arrangements," Holmes said pleasantly, and moved on to inspect the fire irons with every appearance of finding them more interesting than the conversation he had just concluded. Later that evening, when the household had retired and Holmes and I sat alone in the drawing-room, with the fire burned low between us, I told him that I had formed the distinct impression that at least 3 of our 6 companions were concealing something, and that I could not yet determine whether they were concealing the same thing or 3 quite different things. Holmes stretched his long legs toward the grate and considered the ceiling with half-closed eyes. 4, he said. I stared at him. 4? 4 of them are concealing something. The difficulty, Watson, and it is a genuinely interesting difficulty, is that 2 of those 4 believe they are concealing it from me, 1 is concealing it from the others, and the 4th has no idea that what they imagine to be an innocent omission is, in fact, the most consequential piece of evidence in the entire affair. He rose, setting down his glass. "The glove, Watson. Do not forget the glove." He said nothing further and retired to bed, leaving me to sit alone with the dying fire, turning over in my mind the misplaced glove I had noticed that afternoon on the hall table, and had entirely failed, until that moment, to find significant. Chapter 5. Faces and Silences. Holmes was at breakfast before me the following morning, which was itself unusual enough to be remarked upon. He was not, as a rule, an early riser when a case was in its middle stages, preferring to conduct his nocturnal thinking in the small hours and emerge into the day only when thought had sufficiently ripened into plan. That I found him already seated at the dining-room table, a cup of black coffee before him, and the remnants of toast at his elbow, told me that whatever conclusions the night had produced, they had arrived early and with sufficient force to make sleep seem a poor use of the remaining hours. He glanced up as I entered. "Good morning, Watson. The snow has stopped." I went to the window. The garden lay still and brilliantly white, under a sky of pale, washed blue, the first clear sky we had seen since our arrival. It was the kind of winter morning that presents itself with a deceptive prettiness, the cold absolute beneath the brightness, the roads no more passable for the sunshine than they had been under the clouds. We remain confined, I observed, for the present. By this afternoon, if the temperature holds, the main road should be accessible. I therefore intend to conduct my individual conversations this morning, while the sealed conditions still serve us. He set down his coffee cup with the neat finality of a man concluding a preliminary argument. "I should be grateful, Watson, if you would make yourself available to me. I may have need of a witness to certain reactions." The conversations, for they could not strictly be called interrogations, conducted as they were with Holmes's most disarming courtesy, took place one by one in the small morning room off the entrance hall, a comfortable enough space with 2 armchairs and a writing desk that Holmes did not use. I sat to one side, notebook in hand, though Holmes had made plain that he wished me to observe rather than record. The notebook was, he explained later, a useful property. It gave each subject a reason to address their remarks to me rather than to him, which freed him to study what their faces were doing when they believed themselves unobserved. Forsyth came first, as befitted his seniority in the proceedings, and answered Holmes's questions with the careful precision of a man accustomed to deposing witnesses, and therefore acutely conscious of the uses to which testimony may be put. He confirmed the timeline of the previous evening with meticulous consistency, adding nothing and subtracting nothing from what he had already offered. Holmes thanked him, and as Forsyth rose to leave, asked with perfect casualness whether the barrister had noticed anyone handle the hall-table candles during the course of the evening. Forsyth paused at the door. "The hall candles? I cannot say that I noticed, no." "They were burning when you locked the study at 9 o'clock. Yes, I believe so. The entrance passage was lit. I did not attend specifically to the candles." He hesitated, and in that hesitation, slight as it was, Holmes registered something that I saw reflected in the fractional sharpening of his expression. "Is it material?" Forsyth asked. "Everything is potentially material," Holmes replied, with a smile that offered no further information. Arthur Cavendish Mere came second. He was a man who managed his considerable height, with a habitual slight stoop, as though long practice at entering low doorways had become a permanent attitude, and his manner conveyed the particular form of condescension that manifests not as contempt, but as perpetual mild surprise at being required to engage with the world on its own terms. He answered Holmes's questions about the evening with an ease that I found, the longer I observed it, subtly too complete. Most truthful accounts of past events contain a natural irregularity, a hesitation here, a correction there, the small stumbles of genuine recollection. Cavendish Mere's version of the previous evening was smooth from start to finish, the smoothness not of simplicity, but of a narrative rehearsed past the point at which rehearsal leaves its traces. Holmes asked him about the deposition itself, whether he had been satisfied with the conduct of proceedings, so whether the testimony recorded reflected his understanding of the matter at issue. Cavendish Mere said that it did. Holmes asked whether he had remained in the study for the entirety of the session. He said he had. "You did not step out, even briefly. It was by all accounts a warm room." "I did not." He said it without inflection, and his eyes, which were a flat, rather cold blue, remained steady on Holmes's face. Holmes nodded, made no further notation of any kind, and thanked him. As the door closed, I raised my eyebrows. Holmes shook his head fractionally. "Not yet." Miss Dorothea Brent was a rather different order of interlocutor. She entered the morning room with the self-possessed directness of someone who has decided in advance to be entirely cooperative, and there is no more effective defence, I have observed. against a man like Holmes than the appearance of complete transparency. She confirmed that she had not attended the deposition, that she had spent the evening in the drawing-room with Mrs. Vane for a portion of it, alone with her book for the remainder, and had retired at 9:30. Holmes asked her about her relationship with the estate, not the legal particulars, which he acknowledged were properly Forsyth's province, but her personal connection to Blackthorn Hall itself. It was, she said, a house she'd known since childhood, her mother having been a close friend of the late owner. She spoke of it without apparent sentiment, in the level tone of someone describing a geography rather than a history. "And Mr. Price?" Holmes asked. "You have known him some years, I imagine." For the first time, something shifted behind her composed expression. Not alarm, not guilt, but the precise guarded quality of a person deciding how much a truthful answer may safely contain. "Since I was quite young, yes. He has managed this property for nearly 20 years. He is competent and trustworthy in your estimation." "Entirely," she said, and the word carried a weight that its brevity could not quite conceal. Holmes released her, and I thought as she left that he had learned more from the 3 seconds of her hesitation than from the preceding 10 minutes of her answers. Mrs. Vane contributed little that was new, though her stillness under questioning was remarkable. She was a woman of 60 or thereabouts, who had passed through enough of life's difficulties to find a gentleman's inquiries a minor inconvenience, and she answered everything with a tranquil exactness that Holmes, to my mild surprise, did not trouble greatly. He asked her about the fire in the drawing-room, whether it had been tended during the evening. She said Price had seen to it at around 8 o'clock. Holmes thanked her and let her go. Young Hatch arrived last, and arrived, I thought, in a state of suppressed agitation that he was making considerable exertions to contain. He was the sort of young man whose face has not yet learned to disguise what his mind is doing, and the effort of sitting composed in an armchair opposite Sherlock Holmes was visibly taxing his resources. Holmes treated him with a particular gentleness, asking first about his professional duties, his role in preparing the deposition documents, his career with Forsyth's chambers. The young man answered these with genuine ease, and as he relaxed, Holmes slid without any perceptible transition into the questions that mattered. "When you left the study at the conclusion of the proceedings," Holmes said pleasantly, "did you take anything with you?" Hatch coloured immediately. "Only my own papers, my notes from the session." "Of course. And you did not return to the study afterward?" A pause, half a second, perhaps less, but to a man trained in Holmes's school, a pause of geological significance. "No," said Hatch. "You're quite certain?" "Quite certain," he said, and held Holmes's gaze with the effortful steadiness of a man who knows that looking away would cost him more than maintaining it. Holmes thanked him, and when the door had closed sat for a long moment looking at the empty chair. "For he returned to the study," he said quietly. "You're sure?" "He's sure that he should not have done, which amounts to the same thing." Holmes rose, moved to the window, and looked out at the bright, cold, snowbound garden. "And he is frightened, Watson. Not guilty, I think, but frightened. The distinction will matter." Chapter 6. The Hidden Clockwork of the Evening. There is a particular quality to the mid-morning hours of a day that has followed a sleepless or near-sleepless night, a flatness of light and perception in which the mind, stripped of its usual defences, receives impressions with unusual clarity and unusual vulnerability in equal measure. I had slept, but not well, and as Holmes and I walked the length of the first-floor corridor after the conclusion of the interviews, I was conscious of that heightened, slightly raw attentiveness that fatigue sometimes produces. Holmes said nothing for some time. He walked slowly, his hands deep in his pockets, his eyes moving without apparent purpose across the floorboards, the wainscoting, the sequence of unremarkable watercolours that lined the passage wall. I had learned not to interpret this silence as absence of mind. He was, I knew, engaged in the most demanding of his intellectual exercises, the assembly of a coherent picture from components that had not yet revealed how they fitted together. At the end of the corridor he stopped before a small window that overlooked the inner courtyard. a square of snow-covered cobblestones enclosed on 3 sides by the hall's wings. He stood there long enough that I began to wonder whether he had, in some interior sense, left the building entirely. Then he said without preamble, "The evening had a hidden structure, Watson, and it is that structure, not the disappearance itself, which is the true subject of this inquiry. Everyone in this house last night was operating within a timeline. The question is whether they were operating within the same timeline, or whether, beneath the surface of the shared evening, several quite different evenings were taking place simultaneously." I told him I was not sure I followed the distinction. He turned from the window. When a group of people share an experience, a dinner, a legal proceeding, an evening confined by weather, they assume a common temporal framework. 7:30 means the same moment to all of them, but consider what we actually know. Price entered the study at, he says, 7:30 or 7:15. Forsyth confirms only that Price entered during the middle portion of the evening and was asked to be quick. Cavendish Mere places the conclusion of the deposition at 9 o'clock precisely. Hatch, when I pressed him earlier on the duration, said it felt closer to 1 hour and 40 minutes than 2 full hours, which would place the start at 7:20 rather than 7 exactly. Mrs. Vane left the room at approximately 7:15, according to her own account, because she found the fire oppressive. He began walking back along the corridor, and I fell into step beside him. Now, the fire becomes oppressive in a heated room after sustained burning. But Price, by his own account, had not yet attended to the fire at the point Mrs. Vane withdrew. He places his visit at 7:30 to 7:15, and she departed at roughly the same time. A newly laid, sluggishly burning fire does not produce sufficient heat to drive a person from a room within 40 minutes of the proceedings beginning. Either the fire had been burning rather longer than the stated start time would allow, or Mrs. Vane's account of when she withdrew is displaced, or Price's account of when he arrived is displaced. Or all three are speaking to the best of their recollection, and simply misremember, I offered. Watson, you are performing the invaluable service of reminding me not to overconstruct. Yes, honest misremembrance accounts for a great deal, but it accounts less well for the following. He paused at the head of the staircase. Cavendish Mere told us he remained in the study for the entirety of the proceedings, yet Forsyth, in describing who attended, said that Mrs. Vane was present for the first 40 minutes and then withdrew, that Hatch was present throughout, and then paused before mentioning Cavendish Mere, as though the order of enumeration required a slight internal reorganisation. A barrister of Forsyth's experience enumerates witnesses in the order in which they were present. If Cavendish Mere's attendance required reorganisation, it is because it was not continuous. We descended the staircase in silence. I turned this over carefully. Cavendish Mere stepped out at some point. He stepped out and he lied about it. The question of when and for how long, and whether his absence coincides with any other displacement in the evening's hidden clockwork, is what I have been assembling since last night. He pushed open the door to the entrance hall and stopped abruptly. The glove was gone from the hall table. I stared at the empty polished surface where I had seen it the previous afternoon, a single gentleman's glove in dark brown leather, lying apart from the coat stand as though placed there temporarily and never retrieved. Holmes crossed to the table in 2 strides and examined the surface, then the coat stand, then the floor beneath it. "When did you last observe it?" he asked, without looking up. I cast my mind back with the slightly anxious concentration of a man who had not, until this moment, treated a glove as evidence requiring careful temporal registration. "Yesterday afternoon, before we went outside. It was there when we returned as well, I think. I cannot swear to after dinner." "It is Cavendish Mere's," Holmes said. "The stitching at the fourchette is a particular style associated with one maker in Jermyn Street, and the size is consistent with his hand. More to the point, it is the left glove only. A man does not misplace a single glove in a house he has been confined to for 2 days without either noticing or choosing not to retrieve it." He straightened. "Someone removed it. This morning, while we were engaged in the interviews, someone came to this table and took it. Cavendish Mere himself? or someone who wished either to protect him or to remove a piece of evidence whose significance they had begun to suspect. He was quiet for a moment. The glove tells us something about the night in question, Watson. I believe it was not lost here by accident, but left here deliberately by someone other than its owner, as a marker of sorts. A small, thus communicative gesture between two people who could not afford to communicate openly. This interpretation had the slightly vertiginous quality that Holmes's more advanced deductions sometimes produce in me, the sensation of standing on ground that has silently reconfigured itself while I was looking elsewhere. A signal, I said slowly. Between whom? Between the person who borrowed the glove, said Holmes, and the person who was meant to find it. He moved toward the study stairs with renewed purpose. I have been treating the disappearance of the ledger as the crime and everything else as context. I am beginning to think the ledger is itself the context, and the true subject of the crime is the deposition it contains, what was recorded in it, and, rather more significantly, what was not. He took the stairs at a pace that suggested his thinking had arrived somewhere decisive, and I followed, conscious that the morning had shifted in character, the way a river shifts when the gradient changes invisibly beneath it. The pieces were moving. The hidden clockwork of the evening was ticking audibly at last, and I had the strong presentiment that the next revolution of its mechanism would bring several things that had been obscured into sudden and uncomfortable visibility. Chapter 7. The Convenient Discovery. It was shortly before noon when the study yielded its secret, and the manner in which it did so told Holmes rather more than the secret itself. We had returned to the room for the third time since our arrival, Holmes moving through it with the patient, repetitive thoroughness of a man who understands that the same space, examined under different conditions of light and attention, rarely presents an identical face. The morning sun, now well established in a clear sky, entered the south-facing window at an angle that the grey flat light of the previous day had not permitted, and it struck the study's north wall, the wall occupied by the long bookcase, with a slanted, revealing quality that transformed the familiar into something subtly different. Holmes had been examining the upper shelves, running his finger along the spines with the abstracted concentration of a musicologist reading a score, when Forsyth appeared at the door with the junior clerk at his shoulder, and an expression of suppressed excitement that sat uneasily on his careful barrister's face. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "Hatch has something to tell you." The young man entered the room with the particular quality of movement that belongs to a person who has made a difficult decision and is determined, now that it is made, to execute it without flinching. He was pale, and the dark shadows beneath his eyes suggested that his night had been considerably worse than mine. "I owe you a correction, Mr. Holmes," Hatch said. "When you asked me this morning whether I returned to the study after the proceedings concluded, I told you I had not. That was not the truth. I came back at approximately 9:30, perhaps 20 minutes after the session ended. The door was unlocked. I was surprised to find it so, and I entered." Holmes descended from his examination of the upper shelf and gave Hatch his full, quiet attention. "Why did you return?" "I had left one of my notebooks, my professional notes from the session. I use a separate book from the formal deposition record, for my own reference. I had left it on the chair beside the writing table." He produced the notebook in question from his inside pocket, a slim volume in worn black covers, as though its physical presence would confirm the innocence of his errand. "And when you entered, what did you find?" Hatch hesitated. The room was empty. The ledger was on the table, where it had been throughout the session. The fire was very low. I took my notebook and left. I locked the door behind me. The key was in the lock on the inside, which I thought odd, and I removed it and gave it to the first person I encountered in the passage, which was Mr. Price. Holmes turned to look at Forsyth, whose expression had tightened perceptibly. "The key," Holmes said. Forsyth's voice was controlled. "I recovered the key from Price this morning before I came to you. I assumed he collected it for safekeeping. He did not explain its provenance, and I did not ask. "I see," said Holmes, with the neutral even-handedness that signified he saw considerably more than the words implied. He returned his attention to Hatch. "You found the ledger on the table at 9:30. The room was otherwise undisturbed." "As far as I could determine, I was not looking for disturbance, Mr. Holmes. I was looking for my notebook." "Of course." Holmes was already moving back toward the bookcase. "Thank you, Hatch. I shall ask you to remain available." When the two had withdrawn, Holmes stood before the northern bookcase in silence for a moment, and then did something I had not seen him do in any of our previous visits to the room. He set his hands against the bookcase itself, not the spines of the volumes, but the wooden frame, and pushed. The bookcase did not move, but it shifted, not outward, but with a fractional give, a resistance that resolved into a slightly different quality of stillness when released, the stillness of a thing that is not fixed to the wall behind it, but merely resting against it. Holmes reached to the left side of the case and found, at a point where the frame met the wainscoting, a recessed catch of the kind used in household cabinetry to hold panels closed against draughts. He pressed it, and a section of the wainscoting to the left of the bookcase, no wider than 18 inches, swung inward on a pivot. Behind it was a shallow recess in the wall. The depth of the wainscoting's thickness, plus several additional inches of masonry, evidently a remnant of some earlier configuration of the room, a blocked-off serving hatch, I thought, or a passage that had been reduced in a previous century to this functionless residual space. On the floor of this recess, lying flat, was the ledger. I heard Forsyth's sharp intake of breath from the doorway. He had returned, whether from professional instinct or simple anxiety I could not say, and now stood staring at the recovered document with an expression that mixed relief and new bewilderment in equal parts. Holmes lifted the ledger with care, examined its covers, turned to the last completed page, and then closed it and handed it to Forsyth without comment. He then crouched and examined the floor of the recess with his lens, the walls, and finally the catch mechanism on the inside of the panel. He was still in this position when Arthur Cavendish Mere arrived. I do not know what brought him to the study at that particular moment. He had perhaps heard Hatch's raised voice from the corridor earlier, or some instinct connected with his own involvement had drawn him upward. He appeared in the doorway with the slightly too composed expression of a man who has prepared himself for something, and is uncertain whether what he finds matches his preparation. He saw the open recess, he saw Forsyth holding the ledger, and something in his face, some small but definite internal architecture, readjusted itself, producing a look that I can only describe as the expression of a man who had expected a different kind of surprise. "You have found it," he said, "Mr." "Holmes has found it," Forsyth replied, with a quiet emphasis that was the closest the barrister had come to expressing personal feeling throughout the entire proceedings. Cavendish Mere looked at Holmes, who was still crouched at the recess and gave no sign of having registered the new arrival. "Where was it?" "Behind the panel," Forsyth said. "Behind the—" Cavendish Mere stopped. Then, in a tone so smooth and immediate that it would have deceived a less attentive observer, "Hatch. It must have been Hatch. He admitted he came back to the room. He had access, and he was the only one besides you who handled the document directly during the proceedings. He has been behaving oddly since this morning began." He spoke with the fluency of a man offering a prepared argument, and the argument was not without surface plausibility. The boy wanted to sell the contents, no doubt. There are interested parties who would pay handsomely for the testimony in that ledger before the hearing next month. Holmes rose from his crouch, brushed his trouser knees, and looked at Cavendish Mere with an expression of mild and entirely attentive interest. "That is a very complete explanation," he said pleasantly, "for a man who has only just been told where the ledger was found." A silence followed, rather longer than comfort allowed. "I suggest," Holmes continued, turning to Forsyth, "that you keep that ledger on your person until this matter is fully resolved. I have 1 or 2 further inquiries to make this afternoon. I expect the roads will be passable by 3 o'clock. I should be grateful if no one departed before I have had an opportunity to speak to the whole company together." He looked once more at Cavendish Mere, briefly and without particular emphasis. All will be made clear this evening. He left the room before any further question could be put to him, and I followed, noting as I passed Cavendish Mere that his eyes, those flat, cold blue eyes that had been so steady during the morning's interview, were now directed at the empty recess in the wainscoting with an expression that told me he was calculating very rapidly, and that the calculation was not going in his favour. Chapter 8. The Weight of False Certainty. The afternoon arranged itself in the manner of afternoons that precede significant events, with an excess of ordinary time. The sun moved across the study window and began its early winter descent. The roads, as Holmes had predicted, became navigable by 3 o'clock, a fact confirmed by the manservant who ventured as far as the gate and returned with snow on his boots and the intelligence that the main lane was passable to a careful driver. No one left. Holmes had asked them to remain, and whatever authority his reputation exercised over the assembled company it held. I found him in the small household office on the ground floor at 2:30, the room where he had noted the shared chimney stack the previous afternoon. He was seated at the steward's writing desk with his long legs stretched beneath it, and a sheet of paper before him, on which he had drawn what appeared at first glance to be an architectural plan of the first floor. I drew up the second chair and examined it over his shoulder. It was not, on closer inspection, a plan of the floor alone. It was a diagram of movements, a series of lines and intervals annotated in Holmes's compressed precise hand, mapping each person's stated position against a horizontal axis of time. The evening of the 13th of January had been reduced to a grid, and across that grid 6 lines moved, diverged, occasionally intersected, and in 3 cases presented gaps where certainty dissolved into approximation. "You have been building this since last night," I said. "Since the interviews," he corrected. "Last night I was building something less structured, a general impression of where the lies were. This morning's conversations gave me the coordinates." He indicated 2 points on the grid with the tip of his pencil, both occurring in the interval between 8:30 and 9 o'clock. "These 2 gaps cannot both be innocent misremembrance, Watson. They occupy the same portion of the evening, they involve different people, and they each serve the same narrative function. They remove the relevant person from any account of what happened in and around the study in the final 30 minutes before Forsyth locked the door. One of the gaps belonged to Cavendish Mere, whose claimed continuous presence in the study Holmes had already dismantled. The other I saw belonged to Price. "The steward," I said. Holmes set down the pencil. "Price told us he attended to the fire in the study at 7:30. Mrs. Vane confirmed she found the room overheated by approximately 7:45 and withdrew. This is internally consistent. What Price did not tell us, and what the household records in this room suggest, is that his duties on the evening of the 13th did not conclude with the study fire. He is the steward of a house whose drains, in cold weather, require manual attention at intervals. There is a note in this ledger to that effect in his own hand, dated the 12th. He tapped a battered household account book that lay open beside the diagram. The procedure requires access to the cellar. The cellar is accessible from the kitchen passage directly below the study." I examined the account book entry. It was written in a neat spare hand. Drains attended, cold snap. Again, at intervals as required. Below it, another entry in what appeared the same hand, undated. Panel in upstairs study. Hinge requires oil, will attend during next unoccupied period. I looked at Holmes. Price knew about the panel. "Price installed the oil on the hinge," Holmes said, "or rather, he noted its need. Whether he was the one to apply it and when is a question I have not yet put to him directly. But the panel is central to the mechanism of the crime, and Price is central to knowledge of the panel, and these 2 facts, taken together with the gap in his movements, and the fact of his receiving the key from Hatch without explanation, compose a picture that I find difficult to dismiss." He rose and moved to the window which looked onto the inner courtyard. The cobblestones were still thick with snow, undisturbed in the afternoon light. Holmes stood with his hands clasped behind his back. and I recognised in his posture the particular stillness of a man who has arrived somewhere he does not yet wish to declare. "And yet," I said, knowing he was waiting for the objection. He turned with a slight smile. "And yet, you have absorbed more of my method than you sometimes credit yourself with, Watson." And yet Cavendish Mere's reaction when he entered the study this morning was not the reaction of a man who had arranged the concealment himself. His expression when he saw the open recess was not satisfaction, or calculation, or relief. It was surprise. Genuine surprise, Holmes agreed. Not the performed variety, which is a considerably easier thing to produce. He did not know the ledger was in the recess. He knew it had been moved, and he knew broadly why, but he did not know where. He returned to the desk, sat, and looked at the diagram. This is why the solution as it currently presents itself is, as I remarked last night, too symmetrical. Cavendish Mere wanted the ledger displaced. Price had the knowledge and the access to displace it. The ledger was found, and Cavendish Mere immediately and fluently accused Hatch. The architecture of guilt, Watson, is very prettily arranged, almost as though it had been arranged for us. I considered this. The fire had been laid low in the grate, and the room was cool, and I was aware of the slight physical discomfort of a sustained mental effort, pursued in inadequate warmth. You think someone anticipated that the ledger would be discovered, and arranged the circumstances to ensure that when it was, the blame would fall on Hatch. I think someone understood that an impossible disappearance, as once revealed as merely a concealment, requires a culprit, and they ensured that a culprit was available. He tapped the diagram once definitively. What they didn't anticipate was that I would find the concealment before they intended it to be found, or that I would be present when Cavendish Mere learned of the recess and identified himself, in 3 sentences of entirely too fluent accusation, as a man who knew far more about the circumstances than his role as a passive witness to the discovery could justify. He folded the diagram with care and placed it in his inside coat pocket. We sat in a silence that was not uncomfortable, the kind of silence that accompanies the last stages of a complicated piece of work before the final effort is required. Outside, the light was thickening toward the pale gold of a winter late afternoon. Hatch," I said presently, "you told him this morning he was frightened rather than guilty. If he did not move the ledger and does not know who did, why is he frightened?" Holmes looked at me with an expression of genuine appreciation. "Because he read something in the ledger when he returned to the study at 9:30, he said. Something that was not recorded in the formal deposition, or something that should have been recorded and was not. He went back for his notebook, Watson, and found something that alarmed him considerably more. He has not told us what it was. I have not pressed him, because I do not wish him to know that I know he saw it, and because the answer, I believe, will emerge more usefully as part of the full reconstruction." He paused. "Tomorrow morning, when I present the evening's actual sequence to the company, we shall see which faces change and which remain composed, and that, as much as any physical evidence, will confirm what I already know." The winter dusk was settling over Blackthorn Hall, its dark stone held in the last pale light of the January sky. The house felt different to me then than it had on our arrival. Not smaller exactly, but more legible, as though the rooms and the people within them had gradually yielded enough of their secrets to make the whole comprehensible, though not yet fully known. Holmes reached for his cold cup of coffee, found it undrinkable, and set it down with mild resignation. "One more night," he said, to no one in particular, "and then we shall put it to them." Chapter 9. The Reconstruction of the Invisible Crime. Holmes chose the study itself as the theatre for his reconstruction, which I recognised as characteristic. He preferred to lay bare the workings of a crime in the precise space where it had been committed, not for any dramatic effect, though the effect was invariably dramatic, but because the physical evidence still present and available could be called upon to corroborate or challenge each point as it arose. A drawing-room offers comfort, a study offers proof. The company assembled at 10 o'clock on the morning of the 15th of January, a full 2 days after our arrival. The sky beyond the window was the flat, featureless white of cloud reforming after the brief clearance, and the temperature inside the room, though the fire had been laid and lit, has retained the memory of the cold that had settled into the walls over the preceding days. 6 chairs had been arranged in a loose arc before the fireplace. Holmes stood before the empty grate with his hands in his pockets and his coat still on, as though the proceedings were to be brief and he did not intend to make himself comfortable. Forsyth sat with the recovered ledger on his knee and the steady, suspended attention of a man who has long practice at receiving evidence without visible reaction. Cavendish Mere had chosen the chair furthest from the writing table, a placement that Holmes noted with a single unhurried glance and thereafter ignored. Miss Brent sat with her hands folded, her eyes on Holmes with an expression of composed but genuine apprehension. Mrs. Vane occupied the chair nearest the fire with the equanimity of a woman attending a proceeding whose conclusion she had, in some private sense, already accepted. Hatch sat very still, his notebook open on his knee, a pen in his hand, the professional habits of his training providing him with an occupation for his hands that his face could not disguise as anything other than anxiety. Price stood at the back of the room, near the door, having declined a chair with the quiet firmness of a man who prefers to be near an exit. Holmes began without preamble. The ledger, he said, did not disappear. I want to establish that plainly before we proceed, because the word disappear implies a mystery of the first order, and what actually occurred was a deliberate concealment of considerable sophistication that depended for its effect, not on impossibility but on the management of perception. The room was not sealed by the storm, it was made to appear sealed. The window was not frozen shut, it was waxed shut by a hand that understood the visual difference between frost and applied wax would not be examined closely enough to matter. The documents do not vanish from locked rooms, gentlemen, and lady. They are moved by people who have reasons to move them, and the means to do so without immediate detection. He paused to allow the room to settle into the new register. No one spoke. The candle on this mantelpiece, he indicated the left-hand candlestick. It has burned approximately 1 inch since it was last replaced, at a standard rate of consumption for this quality of waxen wick. That represents approximately 3 hours of burning. The proceedings concluded at 9 o'clock, and the household retired by 11. If this candle was lit at the conclusion of the deposition, and burned until the household was fully settled, it was extinguished at approximately midnight, which means someone was in this room, with a light, between the conclusion of the proceedings and midnight. He turned to the writing table. The chair beside this table was moved by someone who was not attending primarily to the chair. Its displacement of approximately 2 inches from its original position, visible in the indentation left in the rug by its habitual placement, is consistent with a person who rose in some urgency or distraction, pushing the chair back without straightening it. Price moved the chair by the door. He told us so, and the scuff marks on the floorboards there confirm it. The chair by the table was moved by someone else during a separate visit, and the direction of displacement tells us they rose from it facing the bookcase, specifically facing the section of wainscoting to the left of the bookcase where the panel is concealed. He crossed to the panel and pressed the catch. It swung open as it had for us 2 days before, and the shallow recess behind it was again visible, empty now. Several faces in the arc of chairs registered the sight of it with varying degrees of recognition. Hatch's pen had stopped moving entirely. This panel was known to one person in this room as a matter of professional familiarity. Holmes looked at Price directly and without apology. It appears in his own household notes as requiring maintenance. He knew its location, its mechanism, and the dimensions of the recess behind it. He also had an unaccounted interval of approximately 30 minutes in the latter part of the evening of the 13th, during which he was not in any of the locations he described to us. Price's expression did not change, but something behind it settled, like a wall accepting the weight it has been carrying. During that interval, Holmes continued, his voice entirely even, Price entered this room, which he was able to do because the key had been removed from Forsyth's custody temporarily. Not stolen, but borrowed. Copied would be too strong a word for the brief impression that was taken, and returned before its absence was noted, with the assistance of someone who had access to the barrister's coat, which was hung in the entrance passage from the moment of arrival. He turned now to Cavendish-Mere. "You provided that access, Mr. Cavendish-Mere, not by taking the key yourself, which would have been dangerous, but by drawing Forsyth away from the entrance passage at a calculated moment during the recess in proceedings. The recess which you claim did not occur, and which both Forsyth's ordering of witnesses and the discrepancy in the session's stated duration confirm did occur for approximately 15 minutes, between 8:30 and 9:15. Cavendish-Mere's flat blue eyes were very still. "Your motive," Holmes said, "was to delay or invalidate the deposition. The testimony recorded in that ledger, if placed before the court next month, confirms the existence of a verbal agreement made between the late owner of this estate and Mrs. Vane, an agreement that substantially diminishes your inheritance and extinguishes a secondary claim you had not disclosed to Forsyth." He glanced at Forsyth, whose expression had contracted to something precise and cold. "I am informed of this by the ledger itself, which I read yesterday evening, and which Mr. Hatch also read, in part, on the night of the 13th, when he returned for his notebook and found the room unlocked, and the ledger lying open at a page that should not have been left open, having been opened, I believe, by Price to verify the entry before he concealed the volume." Hatch let out a long, carefully controlled breath. "The concealment in the recess was intended to be temporary," Holmes said. "The ledger was to be retrieved at the earliest opportunity and either destroyed or altered. Your subsequent accusation of Hatch, Mr. Cavendish-Mere, was the contingency, prepared in advance, as the smoothness of its delivery confirmed in the event that the ledger was discovered before it could be removed." He turned briefly to Price. "You were not indifferent to what you were doing. The glove, your employer's glove, which you placed on the hall table the morning after, as a form of acknowledgement to him that the thing was done, tells me something about your state of mind that a more careful conspirator would not have permitted himself." The room was entirely still. The fire, newly lit, had not yet reached the warmth that transforms a cold room into a comfortable one, and the silence had the particular chill of a space in which several people are recalibrating their positions simultaneously. Forsyth rose from his chair, the ledger held firmly in both hands, and looked at Cavendish-Mere with the expression of a man who has had the floor of his professional assumptions knocked away and is determining, with considerable composure, where to place his feet. Holmes moved to the door and held it open. "I think," he said quietly, "it is time to send for the appropriate authorities." Chapter 10. The Thaw and the Lesson. The authorities arrived from the village at 2:30 that afternoon, in the persons of a local constable of earnest disposition and a detective inspector from the county constabulary, who had made his way out along the newly passable roads with the deliberate, slightly put-upon air of a man dragged from more comfortable circumstances by the reputation of Sherlock Holmes. Inspector Graves was perhaps 45, competent in the solid, unimaginative manner of a county officer who has seen sufficient rural crime to be unsurprised by most things, and was not, I suspected, entirely pleased to find that the essential work of the case had been completed before his arrival. Holmes received him with his customary economy of manner, provided a clear and sequential account of the evidence, and handed over the relevant physical materials, the household ledger with Price's entries, the demonstration of the waxed window latch, the candle and its burn measurements, with the brisk efficiency of a man concluding a transaction that no longer requires his personal attention. Graves listened, examined, and asked 3 questions, each of which Holmes answered in a single sentence. There was, between the 2 men, the restrained mutual acknowledgement of professionals who respect each other's competence, without particularly warming to each other, which I have found to be the most functional basis for cooperation in such matters. Cavendish-Mere was taken in charge shortly after 3 o'clock. He submitted to the formality with the cold composure of a man who has decided that dignity is the only remaining currency available to him, and he spent it with the care of someone who knows it will not last. He said nothing to Holmes, and Holmes said nothing to him, and the silence between them as he was escorted from the study had the definitive quality of a door being closed on a subject that requires no further discussion. Price was a different matter entirely. He remained in the study after the others had withdrawn, standing in the same position he had occupied throughout the Reconstruction, near the door and somewhat apart. When Graves moved to take him in hand, Holmes raised a brief, mild gesture of restraint and spoke to Price directly for the first time since the morning's interview. "You are not the architect of this, Price," he said. "I think you know that I know it. What you chose to do with that knowledge is a matter for the courts and for your own conscience in the interval. But you would be ill-advised to shield a man who had already prepared your clerk as a convenient alternative culprit." Price looked at Holmes for a long moment with those weathered grey eyes, and in them I read something that was neither guilt nor its absence, but something more complicated. The expression of a man who has served a house and its interest for 20 years, and is discovering with the particular bitterness of late revelation that the interests he served were never quite what he had understood them to be. "He told me it was the house he was protecting," Price said at last, "that the agreement Mrs. Vane claimed had never been made, and the ledger contained a fabrication." "And you believed him," Holmes said without inflection. "I chose to believe him," Price replied, and the distinction, precise and unsparing, cost him something visible to say. He went with Graves without further word, and the room, once he had left it, seemed to exhale. The remaining members of the company dispersed through the afternoon with the relieved purposefulness of people released from an obligation that had lasted rather longer than they had anticipated. Forsyth spent an hour in the morning room with his ledger and his professional notes, and emerged looking both satisfied and considerably older. He shook Holmes's hand with genuine warmth, and told him that the hearing next month would proceed as originally intended, the deposition intact and the legal record unimpeached. Mrs. Vane, in departing, paused beside Holmes in the entrance passage, and thanked him in a voice from which all performance had been stripped, leaving only the bare, unornamented gratitude of a woman who had spent years watching an agreement she knew to be real denied by the very confidence of its denial. Holmes inclined his head and said something quiet and particular in response that I did not hear, but which produced in her face a brief, unguarded softness before she collected herself and went out into the afternoon. Miss Brent left without ceremony, which was, I thought, entirely in character. Hatch shook my hand rather than Holmes's, with the slightly dazed look of a young man who has survived a proximity to disaster, close enough to feel the heat, and is not yet sure how to classify the experience. I told him, with genuine feeling, that he had behaved with more courage than he perhaps credited himself with, and that correcting a false statement under the circumstances he had faced required a quality of character that would serve him well. He coloured, thanked me, and went out into the white afternoon looking somewhat less pale than when he had arrived 2 days before. Holmes and I departed Blackthorn Hall at shortly after 4 o'clock, by which time the sky had closed again, and a fine, thin snow had resumed its quiet industry. The carriage that came for us wound back down the elm-lined drive and onto the main road, and Holmes sat across from me in the gathering dusk with his coat buttoned and his hat lowered, and the expression of settled inward calm that follows the resolution of a problem fully worked. I find, in looking back on the case as I've set it down here, that what distinguishes it in my memory is not the ingenuity of the crime itself, which was considerable, but the more instructive quality of the solution. Holmes had not, in the end, discovered anything that was not already present to be discovered. Every material fact was available from the moment of our arrival: the candle, the chair, the hearthstone, the waxed latch, the household notes, the buried footprints, the glove. What Holmes brought to these facts was not information but order. The willingness to treat each detail as significant before its significance was apparent, and the discipline to resist the narrative that announced itself most fluently in favour of the one that accounted without remainder for every small irregularity. I remarked upon this to him as we made our way back toward London, and he listened with his eyes on the darkening fields with the slightly distanced attention he sometimes gives my more reflective observations, and as though considering not what I have said, but whether the saying of it has produced in him any useful addition to his own thinking. The greatest obstacle in this case, he said presently, was not the concealment. It was the confession, or rather, the anticipated confession. Cavendish Mere understood that an impossible crime, once shown to be merely a concealed one, generates an irresistible appetite for resolution. He fed that appetite in advance. He prepared Hatch as the answer before anyone had fully formulated the question, and he very nearly succeeded, not because his arrangement was flawless, but because it was sufficiently plausible, and because plausibility, Watson, is the most dangerous disguise that falsehood wears. Truth is frequently implausible. It is irregular, asymmetrical, and resistant to narrative convenience. When a solution presents itself with the smooth completeness of a thing designed to be found, the first and most important response is suspicion. He said nothing further for some time, and I did not press him. Outside, the fields gave way to the denser, darker edges of the approaching city, its lights appearing in the dusk one by one like sentences of a familiar text being read aloud in a quiet room. I've recorded many of Holmes's cases across the years, and in returning to each one in the writing, I've found that the act of setting them down reveals things that the experience itself concealed beneath its urgencies. The case of the missing deposition ledger reveals, in retrospect, a truth that has broader application than the particular walls of Blackthorn Hall. That truth is simply this, that the discipline required to observe accurately is not a natural condition but a sustained effort, available to everyone and practiced by almost no one, and that the distance between an apparently impossible mystery and a fully explained one is, in almost every instance, precisely the distance between what we choose to notice and what we unconsciously elect to ignore. Holmes fell asleep somewhere near the outskirts of the city. His chin dropped toward his chest and his long hands still in his lap, and I let him rest undisturbed as Baker Street drew closer through the winter dark, thinking of a house sealed by snow, a ledger hidden in plain sight, and the quiet, tireless industry of a mind that had never once permitted itself the seduction of appearances.